Honey, you can't skip your medication.
I know, but it's so hard.
I know, but you have to stick with it.
I'm trying.
Come here. I'm with you.
Diane Marsh smiled at her husband every single night for 2 months, and every single night he believed he was winning. What Robert Marsh never understood was that the woman pouring his coffee, laughing at his jokes, kissing him goodnight already knew everything. She knew what he was doing, she knew why. And she let him keep believing it was working because for the first time in 18 years of marriage she finally had something he didn't, the truth and the patience to use it. This is the story of a woman who chose silence as her weapon, and turned her own husband's plan into the very thing that would destroy him. It started with something so small most people would have brushed it off entirely. A slightly bitter aftertaste in her evening tea, just enough to notice, not enough to explain. Diane almost said something that first night. She almost asked Robert if he'd used a new brand, or if the water tasted different to him too. But something stopped her, some quiet instinct she couldn't name, and instead of asking she simply drank the tea, thanked him and went to bed like nothing was wrong. That single decision to stay silent instead of asking the obvious question would end up changing everything that followed. For weeks Diane told herself she was imagining things. She told herself that 18 years of marriage didn't just unravel because of a strange taste in a teacup, but the feeling didn't go away, it grew. She started paying closer attention to the small rituals Robert had quietly taken over in their home, the pill organizer he now insisted on filling himself, the tea he always prepared before bed without being asked, the way he watched her drink it just a little too closely. None of it was proof, all of it was a feeling. And feelings, she would later learn, are sometimes the only warning a person gets before something irreversible happens. Then came the night she finally decided to find out the truth for herself, and what she discovered inside that medication bag would confirm every fear she had been too afraid to say out loud. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. To understand how Diane Marsh ended up in that moment, staring into a medication bag that would change everything, you have to understand who Robert Marsh was to everyone who knew him. He wasn't the kind of man anyone suspected. He was the husband other women pointed to when they wanted their own husbands to change. He remembered anniversaries. He showed up early to family dinners. He was, by every outward measure, exactly the man Diane had promised to spend her life with 18 years earlier. Which is exactly what made the growing unease in their home so hard for her to accept, and even harder to explain to anyone else. Diane and Robert lived in a quiet suburban neighborhood outside Columbus, Ohio, the kind of street where neighbors waved from their porches and everyone assumed they knew each other's business. To the people on that street, the Marsh household looked like a success story, a long marriage that had survived the hard years most couples don't. But inside that house something had shifted. It wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic. It was the kind of change that only the person living closest to it could feel, the kind that doesn't show up in photographs or dinner parties, only in the small silences between two people who used to talk about everything. So the questions begin here in that uneasy quiet. Why would a man everyone admired, a man with no history of cruelty, no reason anyone could point to, begin quietly altering the one thing his wife trusted him to handle without question? What could push someone 18 years into a marriage to start down a path like that, and what did he believe he had to gain from it? And perhaps the most unsettling question of all, the one that would keep viewers up at night long after this story ends. How does a woman living inside that same house manage to see the truth before anyone else does, including the man responsible for it? Diane didn't have answers yet, not really. What she had was a feeling she couldn't shake, a series of small details that refused to add up the way they should have. And somewhere underneath all of it, a growing certainty that whatever was happening in her home, she was going to have to figure it out entirely on her own. Diane and Robert Marsh met the way a lot of couples in their generation did, through a mutual friend at a summer barbecue, back when Diane was 26 and working as a receptionist at a dental office in Columbus. Robert was charming in a way that felt effortless rather than practiced. He asked about her family, remembered small details from their first conversation, and called exactly when he said he would. To Diane, who had grown up watching her own parents struggle through a marriage full of broken promises, Robert felt like proof that stability was possible. Within a year they were engaged. Within 2, they were married in a small ceremony surrounded by people who genuinely believed they were watching two people who had gotten it right. The early years of their marriage looked, from the outside, like something out of a magazine. Robert built a steady career in insurance underwriting, the kind of dependable job that let them buy a modest home in a good school district before they'd even started a family. He handled the finances, the mortgage, the retirement accounts, everything that made Diane feel like she never had to worry about the practical side of life. At the time, she saw this as generosity. He was protecting her from stress, she told herself, the same way he protected her from difficult conversations with contractors or disputes with insurance companies. It would take years before she started to notice that being protected and being kept in the dark could sometimes look exactly the same. Robert's need to manage things extended quietly into nearly every corner of their life together. He chose which car they bought, which neighborhood they lived in, even which doctor Diane saw when she needed one. When she brought up wanting to go back to school in her 30s, he gently talked her out of it, framing it as concern for the household budget rather than control. Diane rarely pushed back. She had built her entire sense of safety around trusting the people closest to her, a trait she inherited from a mother who taught her that a good wife didn't second-guess a good husband. For most of their marriage, that trust served her well. It gave her a peaceful home and a partner who, by every visible measure, showed up for her. The cracks started so quietly that Diane almost missed them entirely. A comment here, a decision made and only mentioned afterward, a growing pattern of Robert handling things that used to be conversations between the two of them. None of it felt like a red flag on its own. It felt like marriage, the natural drift of two people settling into roles after nearly 2 decades together. Diane chalked up her occasional unease to exhaustion, to getting older, to the ordinary friction of long-term commitment. She had no reason yet to look closer, and every reason, built over 18 years, to keep believing the man she married was exactly who he appeared to be. Everything shifted the year Diane received a new diagnosis, one that required a strict daily medication routine to manage. It should have been a moment that brought them closer together, and at first it seemed to. Robert insisted on taking charge of her treatment plan almost immediately, researching her condition, organizing appointments, and eventually taking over the task of filling her weekly pill organizer himself. Diane found it touching in the beginning. Here was her husband, stepping up exactly the way a devoted partner should during a frightening diagnosis. She had no idea that this single act of care, handing her medication over to Robert completely, would become the thing that quietly reshaped the rest of her life. It didn't happen all at once. It happened in small shifts Diane could barely name. Robert became particular about the pill organizer, insisting she not touch it herself, telling her he didn't want her getting the dosages confused given everything she was managing. He started watching her take her evening dose a little more closely than before, standing nearby with a kind of attentiveness that felt, at first, like love. Diane told herself she was lucky. Not every husband would take this much interest in his wife's health. But somewhere underneath that gratitude, a small, unnamed discomfort had begun to settle in, the kind of feeling she couldn't yet explain and wasn't ready to say out loud. The first symptoms arrived quietly, the way most warning signs do when no one is looking for them. Diane started waking up some mornings with a heaviness she couldn't explain, a fog that sat behind her eyes long after her coffee should have cleared it. Some afternoons she found herself unsteady walking from one room to another, gripping the edge of the counter for balance she never used to need. She mentioned it to Robert the first few times and he was quick to reassure her, telling her this was likely just her body adjusting to the new medication, a normal part of managing her diagnosis. Diane wanted to believe him. He sounded so certain, so informed, that doubting him felt almost unreasonable. At her next checkup, Diane brought up the dizziness and the confusion to her doctor, expecting some kind of clear answer. Instead, she got the kind of vague reassurance that so many women her age have learned to accept without question. Her doctor suggested it might be stress or a natural side effect that could take time to resolve, and adjusted her dosage slightly before sending her home. Diane's closest friend, when she mentioned it over coffee one afternoon, offered a similar response, gently suggesting that getting older sometimes came with exactly these kinds of unpredictable days. Diane nodded along, thanked them both, and told herself the same thing she'd been telling herself for weeks, that she was simply overthinking a situation that had a perfectly ordinary explanation. But the symptoms didn't fade the way ordinary side effects usually do. If anything, they became more specific, more patterned, in a way that started to bother Diane more than she let on to anyone. She began quietly noticing that her worst days, the days when her hands trembled slightly or her thoughts felt slow and disconnected, always seemed to follow the evenings when Robert had prepared her dose himself rather than her doing it on the rare occasions he was out of town. At first she dismissed this as coincidence. A person can talk themselves out of almost anything when the alternative is too frightening to consider, especially when that alternative involves the person they've trusted for 18 years. The turning point came on an evening that started like any other. Robert had already filled the weekly organizer, and as Diane reached for her usual dose, something made her pause and actually look at what was in her hand instead of simply swallowing it out of habit. The pill looked slightly different than she remembered, subtly off in color and texture compared to the ones she recalled from her pharmacy pickup weeks earlier. It was such a small detail that she almost convinced herself she was imagining it, the kind of thing easy to dismiss in a single glance under bad kitchen lighting. But Diane had spent 18 years learning to trust her instincts about her own home, and for the first time, that instinct was telling her something was deeply wrong. That night, instead of raising the question with Robert, Diane made a decision that would define everything that followed. She said nothing. She smiled at him across the dinner table exactly the way she always did, thanked him for handling her medication as thoughtfully as ever, and quietly slipped that evening's pill into a small pouch tucked inside her jewelry box instead of taking it. It was the first genuinely secretive act of her entire marriage, and it terrified her almost as much as whatever she suspected Robert of doing. But some part of her understood with startling clarity that confronting him directly, without proof, without understanding his reasons, would only give him the chance to explain it all away. Over the following days, Diane began collecting more than one saved pill, careful never to take the same one twice from the organizer, careful never to let Robert notice anything different in her behavior. She researched quietly online late at night after he had gone to sleep, learning enough to understand that an independent lab could test a medication's actual contents against what it was supposed to contain. She scheduled the appointment for a day Robert would be at work, telling him only that she had a routine follow-up she needed to attend to alone. It was the first lie she had told him in years, and it came out of her mouth far more easily than she expected it to. The lab Diane chose wasn't affiliated with her regular pharmacy or her usual doctor's office, a deliberate choice on her part, born from a growing suspicion that she needed answers no one close to her existing medical circle could accidentally leak back to Robert. She handed over the small collection of pills she had saved, explained only that she wanted to confirm they matched her prescribed medication, and was told the results would take several days to process. Those days felt longer than almost any other stretch of her marriage. She went through the motions of her normal life, cooking dinner, asking Robert about his day, sleeping beside a man she was no longer certain she knew at all, while waiting for a phone call that would either put her fears to rest or confirm the very worst version of what she suspected. When the call finally came, Diane was standing alone in her kitchen, the same kitchen where she had swallowed countless doses of what she believed was simple, harmless medication. The voice on the other end of the line was calm and clinical, the way professionals delivering difficult information often are, and within the first few sentences, Diane understood that whatever she had braced herself for wasn't nearly enough. The results in front of her confirmed that something was deeply, undeniably wrong with what Robert had been giving her, and the details of exactly what the lab had found were far more disturbing than anything she had allowed herself to imagine. The results from that lab call changed something permanent in Diane. The woman who had spent 18 years trusting the people closest to her without question was gone, replaced almost overnight by someone quieter, sharper, and far more observant than Robert had any reason to expect. She didn't cry in front of him. She didn't confront him. Instead, she began doing something she had never done in her entire marriage. She started paying attention, closely and deliberately, to every detail of the life they shared, searching for anything that might explain why the man she married would do something like this to her. Diane's first move was one she almost talked herself out of a dozen times. Late one evening, while Robert was asleep beside her, she quietly slipped down to his home office, a room she had rarely entered without him present out of simple respect for the boundary he'd always kept around his work. She began going through the drawers he kept locked in every other circumstance, using a spare key she remembered seeing years earlier and never thought twice about. What she found there confirmed that her instincts, the ones she had spent years dismissing, had been right to sound the alarm long before she was ready to listen to them. Among the paperwork, Diane discovered a life insurance policy that had been quietly updated just 4 months earlier. The coverage amount nearly tripled from what she remembered signing years ago. She hadn't been present for the update, hadn't signed anything herself as far as she could recall, and yet there was her name listed as the insured party, with Robert as the sole beneficiary. Beside the policy sat a folder of financial statements showing withdrawals and transfers she didn't recognize, moved into an account she had never known existed. Diane sat on the floor of that office for nearly an hour, staring at documents that painted a picture of her own life she never could have imagined. A few nights later, standing in the hallway outside their bedroom, Diane overheard Robert on a phone call he clearly believed she couldn't hear. His voice was low, careful, and unmistakably tense, discussing something about timing and about how much longer things needed to continue before, in his words, everything could finally be resolved. She couldn't make out who was on the other end of that call, but the tone alone was enough to confirm that whatever Robert was doing, he wasn't doing it alone and he wasn't doing it carelessly. It was a plan, one that had clearly been thought through, and Diane understood in that moment that she was now racing against a timeline she didn't fully understand. For a brief period, Diane's suspicion turned toward her family pharmacist, a friendly man named Gary who had filled her prescriptions for years and had recently started asking unusually detailed questions about her medication schedule. She wondered whether Robert might have found a way to involve him, whether the two of them had some arrangement she couldn't yet see. She spent nearly a week quietly watching for any connection between the two men, checking pharmacy records, even driving past Gary's shop more than once just to observe. In the end, the connection led nowhere. Gary, it turned out, was simply a cautious professional who had noticed an unusual pattern in her refill requests and was following his own quiet instincts, completely unrelated to Robert. A similar suspicion briefly fell on Robert's younger sister, Karen, who had started visiting more frequently in recent months and always seemed a little too interested in how Diane was managing her new diagnosis. Karen brought over meals, asked pointed questions about symptoms, and once offered almost too eagerly to help organize Diane's medication herself. For a few tense days, Diane wondered if she was looking at two people working together rather than one man acting alone. But watching Karen more closely revealed nothing beyond ordinary, if slightly overbearing, concern from a sister-in-law who had no idea what her brother was actually doing behind closed doors. Karen was ruled out and Diane was back to facing the truth alone. With every red herring cleared away, Diane understood with complete certainty that Robert was acting entirely on his own, guided by whatever conversation she had overheard and whatever plan that updated insurance policy was quietly building toward. She could have gone to the police at that point with what she already had, and some nights she genuinely considered it. But she also understood that suspicion and documents alone might not be enough, that Robert was careful, articulate, and universally well regarded, exactly the kind of man people struggle to believe capable of something like this. Diane made the decision that she needed more than suspicion. She needed proof strong enough that no one could ever explain it away. That decision led her to the moment that would define the rest of this story. Diane purchased a bottle of harmless over-the-counter tablets designed to closely resemble her actual prescription in size and general appearance, and began the slow, careful process of substitution. Each week, when Robert filled her organizer while she was occupied elsewhere in the house, Diane would later in private replace what he had prepared with the harmless substitute, carefully preserving his original doses in a sealed container hidden in the back of a drawer he never used. For the first time since this nightmare began, Diane held real power in her own home, quietly redirecting the very plan meant to harm her into the evidence that would eventually expose it. From the outside, nothing about the Marsh household changed. Diane still made dinner every evening, still asked Robert about his day, still sat beside him on the couch watching whatever program he chose, playing the role of a wife who suspected nothing at all. But underneath that ordinary domestic surface, an entirely different life was unfolding. One built on hidden containers, secret documentation, and a growing folder of evidence Diane kept in a location Robert would never think to search. Every smile she gave him now carried a weight only she understood, and every night she spent pretending to swallow a dose she had quietly diverted brought her one step closer to whatever confrontation was waiting at the end of this. Diane began keeping a private log, dated and detailed, recording every dose she diverted, every strange comment Robert made, every small inconsistency she noticed in his behavior. She photographed the financial documents from his office using her phone, careful to return everything to its exact original position afterward. She started reaching out, quietly and separately, to people who could help her build a case strong enough to stand on its own, understanding that whatever came next would require more than her word against his. Diane didn't know yet how this would end, whether Robert would ever face real consequences, or what would happen the day he finally realized his plan had failed. But she knew, with a certainty that had taken her 18 years to earn, that she was no longer the only person controlling what happened inside that house. 2 months into her secret exchange of pills, Diane had become someone Robert believed he finally understood. He watched her move a little slower through the house, noticed her forgetting small details in conversation, saw her decline invitations from friends she used to see every week. To Robert, this was confirmation that his plan was working exactly as intended, that whatever timeline he had discussed on that phone call was finally approaching completion. What he didn't understand was that every symptom he saw was a performance, carefully maintained by a woman who had spent 2 months studying him as closely as he thought he was studying her. Diane had learned through quiet observation exactly what Robert expected to see, and she gave it to him deliberately. She softened her voice when he spoke to her, let her hands tremble slightly when she thought he was watching, allowed herself to seem just distracted enough to convince him nothing had changed. Every performance bought her more time, and every day that passed gave her another entry in the log she kept hidden, another photograph of a document he never realized she had seen, another small piece of a case that was growing far larger than Robert could have imagined. Diane was no longer simply surviving her marriage. She was building the exact kind of evidence that could end it. By the 9th week, Diane's private collection had grown into something undeniable. She had the container of diverted doses, sealed and labeled with dates. She had the original lab results confirming exactly what Robert had been giving her. She had photographs of the updated life insurance policy and the unfamiliar financial account, along with copies of the transfers that had moved money out of their joint savings in the months leading up to her diagnosis. She had even managed, on 2 separate occasions, to record fragments of Robert's late-night phone calls using her phone tucked inside her robe pocket. capturing just enough of his voice discussing timing and finality to remove any doubt about intent. Diane understood she couldn't carry this alone any longer, and the first person she turned to was her older sister, Patricia, a woman who had warned her gently, years earlier, about Robert's need to control every detail of their life together. Patricia didn't hesitate when Diane finally told her everything, driving 3 hours the same night to sit with her sister and go through every piece of evidence Diane had gathered. It was Patricia who insisted they needed a lawyer immediately, someone who could tell them exactly how to proceed without giving Robert any reason to suspect his plan had already collapsed around him. Within days, Diane found herself sitting across from a family law attorney recommended by a friend of Patricia's, a woman experienced in cases involving domestic harm and financial manipulation. The attorney reviewed the log, the lab results, the financial documents, and the fragments of recorded conversation with the calm, focused attention of someone who had seen versions of this story before. She confirmed what Diane already feared, that what Robert had done went far beyond a private betrayal and into territory law enforcement needed to be involved in immediately. Together, they contacted a detective who specialized in exactly this kind of case, a man who listened to Diane's account without a single flicker of disbelief. The detective moved carefully once Diane's evidence was in his hands, cross-referencing the lab results with the financial records and corroborating the timeline against the updated insurance policy. He explained to Diane that the case she had built, entirely on her own, over 2 exhausting months, was stronger than many cases his department saw brought forward by professionals. What Robert didn't know, as he continued his nightly ritual of preparing a dose meant for a wife who no longer swallowed it, was that every piece of the plan he believed was working in his favor had already been turned into the exact evidence that would bring it crashing down around him. The confrontation came on an ordinary Tuesday evening, the kind of evening that had defined so much of their married life. Robert had just finished preparing Diane's dose when there was a knock at the door, one he assumed, based on the time, might be a neighbor or a delivery. Instead, he found the detective standing on his porch, along with 2 other officers, asking to speak with him regarding an active investigation into attempted harm and financial fraud. Diane stood a few feet behind them in the doorway of the home they had shared for 18 years, watching the exact moment Robert finally understood that the woman he believed he had been slowly controlling had, in fact, controlled every outcome from the very beginning. Robert's expression in that moment was something Diane would replay for years afterward, the slow collapse of certainty across a face that had never once doubted itself around her. He looked at her, and for the first time in their entire marriage, Diane watched him search for words and find absolutely nothing to say. The detective asked him to step outside to answer questions, and as Robert followed, visibly shaken, Diane felt something settle inside her that she hadn't experienced in months, not relief exactly, but something close to it, the quiet, exhausted satisfaction of a woman who had finally been believed. In the days following that confrontation on the porch, Robert did exactly what Diane had quietly expected he might. Rather than admitting to what the evidence already made undeniable, he tried to turn the story back onto her, telling the detective and eventually his own attorney that Diane had misunderstood everything, that the changes to the insurance policy were simply responsible financial planning, and that any strange behavior on his part was born out of concern for a wife he believed was struggling more than she let on. For a brief, unsettling moment, it seemed as though Robert's composure and lifelong reputation as the reliable, well-liked husband on their street might actually work in his favor, exactly the outcome Diane had feared most when she chose evidence over confrontation. But Robert had made one critical mistake throughout the entire 2 months of his plan. He had never once suspected that the woman he believed was growing weaker under his control was, in fact, documenting every move he made with a precision he never thought her capable of. When his attorney reviewed the case against him, the recorded phone conversations, the financial paper trail, the lab results, and Diane's detailed dated log, the explanation he'd offered fell apart almost immediately. There was no reasonable version of responsible financial planning that matched a secretly tripled life insurance policy, unexplained account transfers, and a wife's medication that had been deliberately altered for months. Robert's younger sister, Karen, the same relative Diane had briefly suspected of being involved, became an unexpected turning point in how the case unfolded. When she learned the full truth of what her brother had done, Karen didn't defend him the way Diane feared a family member might. Instead, she came forward with her own account, describing a strange conversation Robert had with their father years earlier about wanting to be, in his words, taken care of financially without having to wait for it. It was a small detail, but it corroborated the intent behind everything Diane had already proven, and it made clear that Robert's actions weren't a moment of desperation, but something he had been quietly considering for a long time. Facing evidence that had grown too solid to argue against, Robert ultimately accepted a plea agreement rather than risk a trial that legal experts warned him he was very likely to lose. He pleaded guilty to charges related to attempted harm and financial fraud, avoiding the harshest possible sentence but still facing significant prison time and the complete unraveling of the reputation he had spent 18 years building. The court also moved to void the fraudulent insurance policy entirely, and Diane, through her attorney, secured full access to the finances Robert had quietly hidden from her, finances that were rightfully hers as much as his. For Diane, the legal outcome mattered less than the quiet, private vindication of finally being believed. She sat in the courtroom the day Robert entered his plea, watching a man she had once trusted completely accept responsibility for a plan that had nearly cost her everything. There was no dramatic outburst from her, no need for one. She had already done the hardest part of this story months earlier, alone in the quiet moments when she chose to save a single pill instead of confronting a man she wasn't yet ready to challenge directly. Everything that followed in that courtroom was simply the world catching up to a truth she had known and carried by herself for far longer than anyone realized. What this story leaves behind is something far bigger than one marriage or one betrayal. It's a reminder that trust, the very thing that holds relationships together, can also become the exact blind spot someone else learns to exploit. Diane spent 18 years building her sense of safety around believing the people closest to her, a trait that made her an easy target, but that same capacity for careful, patient trust was ultimately what allowed her to build an airtight case without ever raising a single alarm. Her strength wasn't loud. It wasn't a confrontation across a dinner table or a dramatic accusation shouted in anger. It was 2 months of silence, observation, and quiet documentation, proof that sometimes the most powerful response to betrayal isn't immediate confrontation but patient, deliberate action. Diane's story asks something uncomfortable of everyone watching it unfold. It asks whether the people in our own lives, the ones we trust most completely, might be capable of something we've never allowed ourselves to consider. It asks how many small, dismissible details, a strange taste, an unexplained document, a phone call cut short when we walk into the room, we've already excused away in the name of keeping the peace. Diane almost did the same thing more than once before her instincts finally became too loud to ignore, so here's the question worth sitting with long after this story ends. Would you have noticed the signs sooner? Or would you have done exactly what Diane did, waited, watched, and built your case in silence, trusting yourself even when everyone around you offered a simpler, easier explanation? Diane's story is a reminder that the people we trust the most are sometimes the ones capable of hurting us in ways we never expect, and that the quiet strength to protect yourself doesn't always look like confrontation. Sometimes it looks like patience. Sometimes it looks like silence, carefully chosen and carefully timed until the moment you're finally ready to be heard. What would you have done in her position? Would you have confronted Robert the first night that tea tasted wrong, or would you have done exactly what Diane did, waited, watched, and quietly built a case strong enough that no one could ever look away from it? Let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos.